I am here with Dr. Monique Andrews today. She also is known as Dr. Mo, which I think is a cute name. And we're about to learn about some of the amazing and interesting things she does. The work you do, Dr. Monique, is really interesting. The fields you cover are of great interest to us. Let's find out a little bit about you. Where are you today?
Sure. Today I'm sitting in Half Moon Bay, California, but I'm
What a beautiful
Canadian.
spot.
Yeah, it is a beautiful spot. I spend some time here and I spend some time on Vancouver Island in Victoria, British Columbia.
And a Canadian, you say?
Yep,
We did for many years a conference right there at the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful spot.
it sure is.
Yeah. And tell us about your work. You went to chiropractic school, I know, but it wasn't for sure that you were dead set on being a chiropractor. How'd that happen?
Well, it's interesting because before I became a chiropractor, I became a neuroscience researcher.
Uh-huh.
And I was studying addiction and the neurobiology of stress, actually. And I was on my way to do my PhD at McGill, very famous Canadian, probably the most famous Canadian university.
For sure.
And I met this incredible woman, and she was going to become a chiropractor, and all focus went there. So I followed a girl, and that's how I became a chiropractor.
No kidding. And how do those two professional worlds intersect for you? The
Yeah.
neuroscience research you were doing and the what you learned in chiropractic school.
Hey, what a great question. And I'm not a practicing chiropractor anymore, but a lot of people ask me that. How'd you go from neuroscience to chiropractic? And actually, it wasn't such a great big leap because chiropractic is about addressing and assessing dysfunction of the spine, something that chiropractors call subluxation. And essentially, it's looking at interference in nervous system communication. So it wasn't a great big leap for me. It made sense because there's so much of the science behind chiropractic is based on neurology and neuroscience. And so I left my neuroscience, research project that I was working on, followed this woman, now my wife, to chiropractic school. We then started a practice back in Canada for about a dozen years or so. And then we came to teach at a chiropractic school here in the United States. Did that for a number of years. I was a chair of basic sciences at the college there. And then we left that and founded something that's called the Prana Foundation. And essentially, we have been teaching online to chiropractors and other sort of alternative medical people.
Is chiropractic considered an alternative treatment form out?
Well, this is a point of consternation because if something is an alternative, it implies that you have the same desired outcome. And many chiropractors would argue that their outcome is not the same as medicine. I think medicine is incredible for what it does in terms of acute intervention, emergency based care.
Yeah.
But chiropractic is more focused on a holistic approach. How do we help people thrive, not just survive? And I would argue if we had to choose a single word for medicine, it would be survival. And then maybe for chiropractic, it would be thriving.
So chiropractic is a lot more than just a manipulation that we all understand it to be.
Oh, yes. And certainly there are even differences of opinion within the chiropractic community, but my approach to chiropractic, which would be considered a very principled approach, is more true to its origin, which is to say that we correct subluxation interferences in the nervous system to enhance the fullest of life expression. And certainly there are chiropractors who focus more just on the manipulation side, a musculoskeletal only approach. But for me, from an embodied neuroscience perspective, we know that your brain, your nervous system controls every cell, organ, and tissue in your body. Now, would it ever be good to have any interference in that system?
No.
No, exactly. So the focus of a principled chiropractor, and when I was in practice, that was my focus, was to remove interference so that the innate potential, the innate wisdom of the body could do her job, that you could thrive and have the fullest of life expression.
Now, did you ever learn about or have a point of view about acupuncture?
Yes, acupuncture is another type of really energy focused medicine that predates so much that is available in complementary and alternative medicine, and its impact is far reaching. There are numerous studies looking at the impact of acupuncture, and yet from the clinically trained medical scientific perspective, there's still a lot of doubt around it, which is interesting because oftentimes I think, well, why is there doubt when there is research? And people tend to believe what they want, I think.
Yes, yes. And there is a lot of research around acupuncture.
Quite a bit of research
Yeah.
around acupuncture. Yep, showing its beneficial effects.
And I get the impression, Dr. Mo, that study, research, learning is just a part of your life stream. So what else have you spent time studying and learning about?
You know, my main focus has really been around the areas of stress, trauma, resilience. How can we support each other, in this world in a way that eases our path, that eases the path of struggle? So my focus has been a lot in the area in the last, probably 10 years. I've been studying mindfulness and somatic practices for probably 30, but in the last 10 years, I've really been focused almost solely in this realm. How can we improve our lived experience as human beings through these sort of ancient practices that still pervade and actually are really seeing a boon in popular culture today?
I think there's so much and so much to be learned about the science of coping skills, stress management. And you teach coping skills and stress management in a variety of different settings. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So recently, my wife and I co-founded a new company. It's called cōpe. And essentially, what we know is, we all find ourselves at a crossroads at some point in our health journey where we either have an injury, an accident, an illness. If we don't have a chronic illness ourselves, we know somebody that does.
For sure.
And coping really is our ability to be resilient in the face of a challenge like that. And so, at a time when most of us, if you are faced with a chronic illness or a life limiting diagnosis, this is a time when we most need support. And unfortunately, it's time when people most often feel lonely, they feel isolated, uncertain about their next best steps. And so I teach these practices, which evolved into creating this company that helps people who are either struggling with a chronic illness or a life limiting diagnosis to better be able to cope. And we know through that these mindfulness practices, and again, there are thousands of articles, research papers supporting and showing the impact of mindfulness practices on our ability to cope, to be resilient, right? And so
Yeah.
really we really focus our whole platform around coping on the science of resilience.
And when you say you teach, in what kind of a format would you teach? You mentioned earlier that you do a lot online, but if you were teaching a group and you wanted to set up a program, number of people that you like to have in the optimum, is it workshop formats? Is it how long a program would it be?
Yeah.
What would you expect that someone who really wants to learn and really wants to have the positive experience to learn how to cope and how to deal with stress, what kind of a time frame would they be looking at? What would you think a deliverable would be?
Yeah. Well, so a couple of questions there. First question was basically around in what format do we teach? I do some live instruction, sometimes could be hundreds, thousands of people. Most of the work that we do that's directed towards coping is all online through our coping platform, our cōpe
All
platform.
online. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, people can go there. What's really unique about how we've structured cōpe is that, there are many mindfulness-based platforms online now that people can access, right? So how do you choose? What's really unique about what we did with cōpe was we crafted it with having the person that has chronic illness in mind. Look, if you have chronic illness, you might be in a lot of pain, you might have a lot of fatigue, you might have trouble concentrating. And so it's really important that if you're going to try to learn a new practice, number one, the people that are teaching it really have learned how to create content that's specifically with your challenges in mind. So what does that look like? The practices are shorter in duration. They are more gentle. They are designed specifically knowing that people may have to stop and come back, or that they may not be able to commit to doing it every single day. So we train all of our teachers to most accurately be able to create content that is going to be accessible regardless of your level of ability. But one thing that we definitely recommend is that you try and get in and do it every day, because the research shows if you want to create changes in your brain and your body, then three things are required. Number one is attention. You have to actually focus on what it is that you're doing. The second is action. You have to actually do it.
Is there one before that? Do you have to come with a predisposition to expect that you can be helped?
I would argue absolutely. There's an interview on our cōpe channel that is with a scientist, a researcher who studied medical miracles, what in medicine they call spontaneous remission.
Mhm.
And she says four things are required. One of those is you have to have a desire to live. You have to believe that you can be helped. You have to have exhausted all possible means of intervention. And then finally, you have to have the will. There must be an intention that you're going to survive and that it's possible.
So it sounds like some of your training is a good part of your training, rather, is geared around helping you to be able to help yourself.
Well, I think if you don't think you can be helped, it's very hard to help somebody, right? What's that saying? You can lead a horse to water.
And have you been wowed by people's ability to harness their own energy forces to deal with both stress and the underlying cause if it's a medical issue?
It's mind baffling the changes that you can see in people when they decide. There's a whole field of epigenetics, and in conventional science and conventional medicine, they would have you believe, for the most part, that your genes control everything, right? Now, what
Yeah,
we know from quantum physics is what's happening up here can have an incredible impact of what's happening down here, right? So
sure.
what's happening in the mind beyond the level of the physical can really dramatically change what outcomes look like. Now,
Hmm.
that's not all to say that that's all in the metaphysical realm, because we know, for example, they did this really interesting study. I'm going to share this with you. They did this study where they were looking at inflammatory cytokines in the body. Now, when I say inflammatory cytokines, what do I mean? These are physical chemical biomarkers of inflammation in the body. It can be measured quantitatively by science. They did
Uh-huh.
this study where they had people come in. These were just your average person. They had come in, they thought that they were just going to have this experience. And so when people arrived, they were told, you have to give a 15-minute presentation on why you want a particular job. Now, I don't know if you know this, but public speaking is more feared than death, right? It's the number one fear for people's public speaking. And so these
Yep.
people come into this research lab, they're told you have to give a 15-minute presentation on why you want this job. Now, so what happens in the bodies of these people? So their thoughts drive these inflammatory cytokines up to such a high level, they're almost off the charts. Now, what does that mean? What does that translate to? Your thoughts can drive inflammation in the body. Now, conventional medicine tell us
So there has to be an inverse of that, no?
exactly. Now, before I tell you about the inverse, let me tell you that inflammation is the primary cause of 7 of the 10 leading causes of death.
No.
Yep. Cancer, heart disease, diabetes, we can go right down the list. 7 of the 10 leading causes of death, at the core of that is inflammation. Some people would argue it's even higher. So if your
So that's
thoughts,
all obviously metabolic.
no, it's not all obviously metabolic. That's what I'm telling you. Your thoughts have an incredible influence on your body's ability to modulate the level of inflammation in your body, except conventional medicine, conventional science doesn't tell us this, right? If you can turn up your inflammation with your thoughts alone, then maybe if you learn to regulate your thoughts, you can learn to regulate inflammation and change the trajectory of your entire lived experience when it comes to your physical and mental, emotional health.
But it's just learning the processes and developing the tools to do that where you come in.
Yeah. So when we talk about mindfulness, what do we mean? Mindfulness is not about not thinking. A lot of people think learning to meditate. When I say mindfulness, I don't just mean meditation. A lot of people think mindfulness means learning to not think. In fact, it couldn't be farther from the truth. If you're a human being, you have a brain, you have a mind, you're going to think. It's not possible to not think. In fact, if you weren't thinking, I mean, that's not compatible with life. You have to navigate your day. You got to drive your car. You got to pick up groceries. We count on our ability to think. What mindfulness does is it allows us to focus our attention so that we don't get distracted by spontaneous, unplanned thoughts, or by thoughts like you're sitting in a research lab freaking out, thinking I have to give a public talk. And then all of a sudden, those thoughts alone actually drive this whole sympathetic nervous system to create a fight or flight response. It turns up those chemicals, right, that actually create a real trauma experience in the body, that increase stress, that increase inflammation.
Tell us, if someone wanted to go and take one of these online courses at cōpe, what's the URL they would go to?
Oh yeah, letscope.org. And you can even just drop in. There's some different options on the platform. So you could come and you could do a 30-day program. You could do a 10-day program. You can also do a la carte. Like you can just come on and try a class. And yep, letscope.org. And it's very simple. What we know from the science is it takes at least 21 days to start to create change in your brain, in your body, 90 days to get long-standing changes. And it's just incredible what we've been seeing, the feedback that we've been getting through people's experience just by starting to learn some of these practices. And they're not just all mindfulness. Some of them are yoga, Pilates, Qigong. We have interviews on there with thought leaders in the coping and resilience realm, people like Bruce Lipton, Don Tamasulo. Like these are names that people would know
Yes.
and get to experience.
Pull one of those stories off the top of your head, if you would, about someone who's told you the impact it's had on them.
So something that we hear a lot is people feel really isolated. And so this one young woman who has, I would say, a life-limiting diagnosis, long-term, like fibromyalgia, that kind of autoimmune situation where, medicine takes it so far and then it's kind of like, well, we don't really know what to do with you anymore. We don't have answers.
Mm-hmm.
So this young woman, she's in her 30s. She comes onto the platform, again, feeling pretty isolated, alone, dismayed, and starts to engage in the practices. And after about, I think it was around 45, maybe 60 days, she reaches out and she says she'd never felt so seen for the first time in her life. One of the things that we do, in addition to taking classes, we also have these live sort of peer-to-peer circles where you can meet, group circles, and talk and share your experiences. And so we did one of these live circles, which was dance, but it was all done with this dance instructor who was in a chair. So again, acknowledging that not everybody has different levels of ability. And so it was after this one particular dance class that we did, about 45 minutes, a live class. And this young woman says, she'd never felt so seen in her whole life. Wow. That's a pretty big deal, right? And that she was starting to see, she could feel changes in her body. She felt more hope, more a sense of purpose after having been in this place of despair for about 10 years. That after being and working and connecting with people and doing the classes in the cōpe platform, that after 45 days, she was start to feeling like there was some light entering her life again. And for me, that just changes everything. Like, this is what we're here for, to help one another, right? I think if you can help one person feel better for even a moment, that really gets to the essence of what we're trying to do in terms of support one another to ease the path.
Let's take it to the next logical step, which is, as you help people to help themselves, the big topic of discussion that we hear so much about now is longevity. And I would think that there's an absolute direct correlation between people's proper attitude, positive attitude, and longevity. Because that young lady who 10 years suffered with depression and has seen a light and finding her way out with your help, her prospects for a longer life just dramatically begin to improve. What are your thoughts on the discussions around longevity? We have treatments and cures in both mainstream medicine and alternative medicines now that are showing real benefits. Just in the last couple of decades, we went from millions of people dying from HIV to now having a treatable chronic condition. We're hopefully past the big punch in the gut that COVID was to the world, and it's becoming more of a manageable disease. Life expectancy, when President Roosevelt instituted Social Security, when he set retirement age at 65, life expectancy was 62, and now it's 78 or more, even with the hit that COVID delivered to us. So we are living longer, and there are lots of folks who are. I have several friends, I can think of 5 or 6 off the top of my head, who are 90 or above and are still living very full, rich, and important lives. I would tell you the common element of all 5 that I'm thinking of right now are that they're still extremely active, still working, still making a difference, and very socially connected. So talk to me about how you think about longevity.
Yeah, I think something really stands out there amongst all of the things that you just said about your friends who are, I forget, you said in their 90s, who
Yep.
were,
I'm thinking of five individuals who are 90 or more.
You said they were still working,
Yep.
which means they have purpose. You said something else that made me think, well, they're obviously still curious. They're engaged in their life, right?
Big time.
Big time. And connection.
Mm-hmm.
Most people probably don't realize that connection is actually a biological imperative. What does that mean? It means that connection is required to survive. Our nervous systems are wired for connection. I think if you are curious, in fact, this is the recipe for longevity. I think if you're curious, if you have meaning in your life and you have connection to other human beings, I think this is a recipe for longevity. Look, there are many drugs that now make us live longer. Some people would argue sometimes drugs make us die longer, that we're around for a longer period of time, but are we truly living? You mentioned, for example, people with HIV living longer. Did you know that the rates of depression in people with HIV are 22 to 77% higher than in the general population?
It doesn't surprise me, but I didn't know it.
Right? Cancer patients, 25% higher rates of depression and anxiety. So here we have.
Is that measured when they are after diagnosis, or do you think that contributes to the diagnosis?
Well, I mean, what an interesting question, right?
Is it causal?
The chicken or the egg? Is it causative?
Yeah.
Well, we know that people with depression also have higher levels of inflammation, and we know that people that have higher levels of inflammation are likely to have cancer. But certainly, nobody would argue that a cancer diagnosis wouldn't cause depression, right? Anxiety,
Yes.
these things. So we see all these links, right? And it just goes back to why we started teaching these practices in the first place, because people with chronic illness, and make no mistake, you might be shocked to hear this data, and that is almost 50% of Americans have one chronic illness. Almost 20% have 2 or more.
No.
Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
We're a very sick population. And given that we know that if you engage in these practices, it improves your ability to cope. It improves resilience, right? Resilience is your ability to prepare for, adapt to, and recover from challenge. Why wouldn't you want to engage in some practice that changes the trajectory of your life? And if you're interested in longevity, and I'll be really honest, Jim, I'm more interested in quality than quantity of life. But I will tell you this, when you do mindfulness practices, which are about focusing attention expands time. What do I mean by that? that when you have focused attention, when you're able to very specifically shine the flashlight and keep it in a particular place, it makes time seem longer.
Yes.
Attention
Mhm.
expands your life because the practice itself, honing your focus and awareness, makes it seem as though time lasts longer. And if you're truly invested in a longer life, then you should also be invested in mindfulness.
So do you specifically address the aspects of longevity in your work, or is your work is it a byproduct that if you're helping people to have that focus, to have that proper state of mind, that awareness of the things that they need as inputs to have a good, healthy, constructive, fruitful life, that results in longevity?
Personally, me, no. Again, I'm giving you my bias. My bias
Yep.
is more quality over quantity, but I know
Mhm.
other guides, other teachers on our platform very likely address the concept of longevity. Look, I know people are very interested in longevity, and I will say that these practices definitely impact it. For me
Mhm.
personally, it's not my area of that makes my heart sing.
In the last couple of weeks, I've been looking at and trying to learn from really smart people about the influence of diet on our health, on our longevity, on our mental state. And I tell you, the conclusion I'd make is that there's some good evidence that we're killing ourselves with sugar.
Yeah, a study just came out from the World Health Organization looking a global study on mental health. And what they found in cultures that the higher the level of, they call them UPFs, ultra processed foods. The higher the level of ultra processed food, the greater the impact on mental health. And then, of course, the inverse is true, right? So
Mm.
if you're eating a lot of really processed foods, then there's an inverse relationship with the level of mental health, meaning the badder the food, the badder, the worse the food that you eat, the worse the mental health. The better the food that you eat, the better mental health outcomes that you're going to have. And the United
Wow.
States has one of the worst mental health pictures right now. Over the last 4 years, right? So actually, people will be listening to this later, but in real time, today is March 11th. It's 4 years to the day of the anniversary that basically the world shut down because of the
Indeed, it
pandemic.
was. Mm-hmm.
Yep. Rates of anxiety, depression, suicide have skyrocketed in the last 4 years. A lot of that is due to isolation, lack of social connection, but there's been a change in what's happened with people's financial abilities. And there's a direct correlation between people's level of income and how they can source food and high quality foods. The more stressed you are, people tend to stress eat. That means more sugar. The more sugar, the more ultra processed foods you can consume, then the expectations of mental health actually decline. It's very sad, actually.
It's amazing how we do know so much about it, but some of us would rather bury our heads in the sand.
And this is another thing that we teach about on cōpe is actually how to improve nutrition, even within limited resources, limited abilities. How
Yeah.
can you improve your nutrition in a way that's going to have positive impact on outcomes in mental and physical health?
Dr. Mo, what's your point of view on the impact, near term and longer term, that these GLP-1 drugs might have on us?
Anytime we have new drugs, there's a really interesting trajectory on how quickly new drugs get to come to market. And I think that we always have to proceed with caution. So I'm not an expert in the arena. I always say that drugs and surgery are the last possible resort, that any steps that we can take to actually create change ourselves through practices, through reading, through discovery, anything that we can do, drugs and surgery are always last possible resort for me. And so that's my own personal perspective. But it's why we teach the tools that we do, self practices for people to create changes in their mind, in their body, so that they are empowered with the tools themselves. Again, are drugs sometimes necessary? Absolutely. For me, it's always the last possible step.
Gotcha. But I wonder, I've read some Wall Street analysis of what the longer term impacts could be. And it's really amazing that they say that be prepared for the snack food companies, the ones you're talking about, to see significant declines in sales. They're talking 2, 3, 4%, which is enormous on a countrywide basis, that it could have an impact on the fast food industry. They're talking about how it's also impacting people who are on it or having less desire for things they might have consumed before, less desire for alcohol. These could have far-reaching effects. I just worry about what we don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's desirable effects and undesirable effects for anything that you put into your body, whether it's a candy bar or insulin. It doesn't matter. Everything has desired and undesired effects. In conventional science and medicine, the undesired effects are called side effects, and they're often downplayed. Again, we have to take a great deal of precaution and approach with trepidation any new substance we're going to put into our body. Obviously people are biased when you bring something new to market. You want to have sales. So we don't always get a real clear picture on what is happening on both sides of the effect scale.
I just worry about the rubber band effect with these. But we will learn fairly soon, I suspect, because they're in high demand for sure. And I have seen remarkable results from people I know who've taken them. I have someone I'm close to who lost 80 pounds. I didn't think he needed to lose 80 pounds, but he did, and it's just amazing. Let's move on to our last subject, because I know you do a lot of work in an area that I find to be particularly interesting, because what we're afraid of at the end of life is what happens after at all, but we're afraid of just the act of dying before we get to the question of, is there anything beyond? And you're doing a lot of work in the end of life with a doula concept. We know there are women who help other women to have their children. They're called birthing doulas. And now an end of life doula. It's a concept I'd not heard before I read about you, Doctor. Tell us what's going on in that arena. What are you doing?
Yeah, so I'm not an end of life doula, but my wife is. And she also was a neuroscientist and a chiropractor, as well as a doctor of natural medicine, but more recently came into doing work in this realm. Everybody's familiar with a birth doula. And here we are, really nurturing people into life. We should also be nurturing people out of it. And I think we're at a point, because there's been such a high level of intervention, I think we're at a point where our technology is upstaging our humanity. And it used to be that death and the dying process was a community event. It was a family event. People died at home. Most people still want to die at home. Something like 77% of people who die in hospitals want to die at home. And so why isn't it happening? I believe a lot of that is due to the fact that there is a whole medical machinery in place that is again, it's people don't understand what their rights are, and they're scared. And so what's called the death positive movement, and something that my wife is deeply involved in, being a end of life doula, is really helping nurture people through that process. How can you make peace with your end of life? Because don't we all want that? Nobody wants to die in fear. Nobody wants to die with a great deal of trepidation. What if you could approach that experience with the same, imagine, joy that we approach somebody coming into life? And it's only until we have more conversations, more teaching, more understanding around it, and more support are people going to be able to get that place where that the death experience becomes a compassionate community event where a life gets celebrated on the way out just as it would on the way in.
There's a hospital here in New York called Calvary Hospital, and all they do is specialize in the end of life. And they do it with such dignity and grace, a strong sense of faith. I was at a dinner a few months ago. A friend of mine was honored for the work he's done with them over a 25-year span. But you get to interact with these people, and they're just such special and wonderful and caring people. And to have that as a mission, to help people at the toughest moment in their life, when they know they're soon to be gone from this world. It's a special group of people who can do that work and do it so effectively, and we're so grateful for them. Is there an organization that's training people to be these end-of-life doulas?
Oh, yes. And I can't name it off the top of my head, but you can learn to become an end-of-life doula There's a whole certification process, and
Oh, is it?
more
Yeah.
and more people are coming to that. Jim, I will tell you, baby boomers, which make up such a large portion of the population, within the next 20 years, there will be more people over the age of 65 than under the age of 18. And this is the first time that's ever happened in our lifetimes.
Hmm.
So, we're going to have more and more people approaching that part of life where, it's inevitable you're going to come to the end. And again, if we can find
Even if it
ways,
is longer away than it was 30 years ago, it's still
and
it's still going to happen.
yeah, you're going to come to the end. And wouldn't you rather come to that place with a sense of joy and completion than fear
And
and despair
connectivity.
and connection? And there are many different levels of dueling. Being a doula is not just hospice. While that is one big part, there's also a planning component. And that's something
Mhm.
that we do talk about on cōpe, is like, how can we help nurture people through that process by giving them some insights and even what options are. And my wife works with people sometimes one-on-one, helping them understand what their options are on the way out, even in terms of how do they want to be buried? Do they want to be cremated? What do they want? There are many, many options.
And would she work with their families?
Yes, that's the whole point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we do interventions when people have other kinds of problems, and it would seem to me that there's interventions of sorts, a group gathering and a discussion and a learning and an expression of care and concern to make sure that the person's end of life in this world is as graceful and as warm and as loving as it can be.
Yeah. And guess what? If you plan your end of life, you don't leave a mess behind for other people to clean up. One of the hardest things when somebody dies, if they haven't sort of taken care of not just what their wishes are, but even just the logistics of day-to-day life. Where's the title for their car? What are their bank accounts? All
Yeah.
these things, like there's a whole checklist and system she has for people where it's like, let's make sure that when you die, you don't leave a mess behind.
Well, with the demographics you mentioned, it's that service, that thinking, that planning is going to become more and more in demand.
Yeah.
And especially, in my lifetime, we went from, and it's been a long life, thank goodness, we went from families lived together in multi-family situations. So, nursing homes wasn't something that we ever even thought about.
Yep.
To a very different state now. We move away. We don't live where we grew up. Not multi-family situations, a multi-generational family situation. So it's a very different situation. So those services, that thinking, that help that you deliver through the programs you do at letscope.org, more and more important. And on that subject, the last thing I said the last thing before, but the real last thing I'll ask you about is, it seems to me that there's a lot about rituals. Certainly, there's a lot about rituals when there is a death, but that's mostly for those that are still living. Are there an emergence of rituals and this new attitude about the end of life that you see are particularly important? We know rituals are important to us in every facet of our life, but are there rituals around the end, like you say, not leaving a mess, being deliberate, thinking about, so that maybe you have peace of mind because you've planned?
Yeah, I think ritual is really important. Certain religions have very specific rituals around how they prepare the body, time spent with the body. There are even some aspects around how long people think the soul or the spirit stays around. And so there are
Yes.
certain rituals around leaving food out. There's all sorts of possibilities. People can develop their own. I think the really important thing about ritual is it's kind of like a symbolic gesture, maybe to spirit or God or source, or however you think about that, that signifies an acknowledgement, an awareness. And I think that makes us more transparent to the transcendent. Not to get all
Well,
esoteric, but
well, but it is.
yeah.
And I wonder if, a suggestion from the cheap seats is that's an interesting program at letscope.org where you could introduce that subject to people. This isn't the cost. This is the cost to tell you about the cost. That if you take it, here's what we'll help you to do in 14 steps. Just happens to be the same number of stations on the cross, but that's a whole different subject. But interesting work you do every day, and you travel the world doing it. You've spent your life learning about all the different disciplines and sciences that go into a healthy, fulfilled, caring life. And my applause to you and the work that you do. And thank you for sharing your story, your lessons, and your experiences with us today. I think we're all richer for it.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim. And listen, I want to just give a gift to your listeners. If anybody wants to go to letscope.org, we'll give them a free premium membership, 90 days. Just use the code 1-800-COPE and you'll get a 90-day free membership, a premium membership. You get access to all the cool stuff. Again, 1-800-COPE.
It's very nice of you, and I bet a lot of people you take you up on that because you have a lot to teach and a lot to help us to learn. Thank you, Dr. Mo, better known as Monique Andrews. Dr. Monique Andrews, thanks for spending some wonderful time with us today.
Oh, thank you so much, Jim. Appreciate you.